You know, life holds a good number of inevitabilities for all of us. If you've enjoyed the Elder Scrolls series in the past, it's almost certain you've been exposed to Oblivion's Radiant conversation system. And yes, while it is a dated, barely functioning mess, today I might be checking myself into a mental hospital as I'm gonna be talking bad about Skyrim and good about Oblivion. Yeah, I know. But what does this entail? Well, you might have completely forgotten this, but Oblivion's random conversations held some really interesting background lore. Skyrim, however, retconned basically all of this. A retcon, in my eyes, is almost as bad as a classic content cut, as something of value has now been lost. Although it at least has some kind of explanation, for all intents and purposes you can still see this as some cut content coverage. But what's this all about? Before I can delve into all of that, I'm gonna explain how the random conversations in Oblivion actually work. Most of them exist in parts. You have question voice lines, which are then followed up by a response voice line. Then they are either followed up by a goodbye line or a follow-up line, which just means that a single line is followed up by another question-response conversation. There are many types of these conversations set up in Oblivion, and they're all actually quests. You have generic ones, city-specific ones, and race-specific ones, among others. The one I'm interested in, however, is the quest known as Generic Current Events. Like you could have guessed based on the name, this quest contains all the dialogue that has NPCs talking about current events. What intrigues me though is that basically all these lines talk about the current events in other provinces. Yeah, cause why flesh out the one you're in with more dialogue, right? So you may be familiar with the questions that are contained in this quest. There are 3 possible starters.
Have you heard any word about the other provinces? Heard any news from the other provinces? What's the news from the other parts of Tamriel?
Which could then result in NPCs choosing from one of 2 response banks, either current event responses or Tamriel Gate responses. Both are equally interesting in my eyes. We'll start by looking at the normal responses. I'll also group the responses together by province, and then we'll see what we've actually learned.
Many Argonians say they have been called back to Black Marsh. They disappear into the swamps and are never seen again. I hear the legions have been recalled from Fort Swampmoth in Black Marsh, and many of the Argonian slaves have returned to their tribes. Black Marsh has become more dangerous than ever. Many settlers have been lost, and most non-Argonians have left in fear.
Sounds like the Empire has given up on stopping the skooma trade and elsewhere. And I hear tribal chiefs are supporting the Ren Ridgerakren. The skooma trade is making a lot of money for the tribes and elsewhere, and a lot of that is going to the Ren Ridgerakren.
That skooma trade is bad business, and the Renridrakrin are just a bunch of thugs. If the Empire isn't going to stop this skooma trade, who will?
They say syndicates of wizards have led a boycott of Imperial goods in the land of the Altmer. I understand Daedra worship has become increasingly prevalent in the Somerset Isle.
It seems Somerset Isle has become a much more dangerous place. The Altmer have powerful wizards. It could be a dangerous situation. I have heard that the great houses of Morrowind are in upheaval. Indoril is in ruins, and Redoran is besieged by the Nords of Skyrim. Rumor has it the Nerevarine has left Morrowind on an expedition to Akavir and has not been heard from since. They say that King Helseth has made an alliance with House Dress. Together they pick apart the carcass of ruined Indoril. They say that slavery has been abolished in Morrowind. House Dress and Hlalu have renounced the slave trade and freed the beastfolk from servitude.
I hear that the Nords of Skyrim have been warring with the Redoran of Morrowind. I have heard that Nord warriors have traveled from Skyrim with Orc mercenaries to assault the Redoran of Morrowind. There are rumors that the Nords are attempting to capture the whole of Solstheim and remove the Imperial fort on the island.
I'm not surprised. It seems that Skyrim is always involved in a border dispute. The Nords have always been protective of their territory. It's no wonder they get involved in these disputes.
Okay, so I'm really giddy after hearing all of that. I'll be honest, this stuff just makes you imagine the greatest of possibilities. But let's recap. Firstly, the Black Marsh rumors talk about an Imperial fort called Swampmoth, which is very in line with the Morrowind naming scheme of Imperial forts, which is a cool throwback. Besides this, it seems that the histories have the ability to recall most Argonians or at least communicate with them, which is also a very cool concept. This influx of Argonians is only strengthened by the release of many beastfolk slaves from Morrowind. Of course, it seems that for non-Argonians, the land became inhospitable, but overall I'd say Black Marsh came out of this mess in a good way. The Somerset Isles rumors? I don't really know what to make of those. The wizards boycott imperial goods and Daedra worship is on the rise. I guess neither of those are really good, but they aren't that noteworthy, I'd say. Elsewhere rumors just talk about how the Empire's war on drugs is basically failing, and local militia group the Renridja are making money whilst being supported by local chieftains, which is also an interesting tidbit mentioning their leaders. But by far the most interesting rumors are those connected to Skyrim and Morrowind. I'll group them together since there seems to be a lot of thematic overlap anyways. So let's see. Apparently the Nords of Skyrim, alongside some orcish mercenaries, are battling with the Redorn armies of Morrowind. Not only that, but they also want to take over the whole of Solstheim and remove the presence of Fort Frostmoth. Based on the ending lines, it seems that this war is over some territory dispute, so it's possible that only Solstheim is meant to be a battlefield. Nonetheless, while House Redoran is apparently besieged by the Nords, House Indoril has completely crumbled into complete disarray. And not only that, King Lalu Helset has aligned himself with House Dress, with the two great houses now teaming up to completely finish off House Indoril. The same great houses, Dress and Lalu, have also apparently released all their slaves, as slavery got abolished in Morrowind. This ties back in with the influx of Argonian slaves returning to Black Marsh, which is a nice touch. And finally, the Nerevarine apparently ventured out on an expedition to Akavir and hasn't been heard from since, which is a cool open end for the character I suppose. But let's turn this into a nice little overview, shall we? The great houses all have a little something interesting going on, which has all been mentioned in the rumors. Redoran is at war, Indoril is basically finished, and Dress and Lalu are both thriving. But seems there's something missing in all this. Of course, we haven't heard anything about the Telvanni yet. Well, they'll get their mention in the form of a gate response. These responses function similarly to the ones you've heard, although this time they only focus on two provinces, Skyrim and Morrowind.
There is grave news from Skyrim. From Falkriath to Windhelm, the foul Daedra attack the land. I hear all of Skyrim is under siege. The Daedra lay waste to the old holds, and there is little to do to stop it. There are foul tidings from Skyrim. The Greybeards speak of the end of all times.
Skyrim's rumors basically confirm that the entire province got hit hard, with the old holds getting hit the hardest. That name refers to the Pale, the Rift, Winterhold and Eastmarch, if you didn't know. I also find it funny how the Greybeards are mentioned here, as it's clear they were never really developed past wise monks that exist in Skyrim at this point. Though, I guess if you have Skyrim in the back of your head, them calling for the end of times is kinda intimidating. Speaking of intimidating though, here is what's going on in Morrowind.
I have heard things are bad in Vardenfell. The Telvanni do their best to close the gates, but it is to no avail. I've heard nothing good. In Morrowind, they say the man-god Vivek has gone missing. Some believe he has been taken by the Daedra. Many are dead in the land of the Dunmer. Even St. Jub, who drove the cliff racers from Vardenfell, has fallen to the Daedra hordes. The news has not been good. I've heard it said that the Daedra have overrun the town of Aldrun. The entire town has been destroyed.
So there's the Telvanni mention. I guess it doesn't really tell us much about the state of the house, beside the fact that they are still powerful enough to take on the task of combating the Daedra horde, which I guess means the public still holds them in pretty high regard. Vivek's disappearance is also an interesting concept, but I wonder if they were really trying to tell a story there, or if they just wanted to retcon the living god out of existence. Who's to say? Then the next line is also quite interesting as it mentions Saint Giab. Saint Giab is actually Giab, the first character you meet in Morrowind. In Oblivion, it's hinted at that he rose to sainthood after wiping out the cliff racers from Morrowind. Yes, the text misspelled cliff racer, but besides that, this is only one of two voice lines that mentions Saint Giab in all of Oblivion. The other is a greeting which belongs to Burs Grokash, and just like the majority of his dialogue, it seems weirdly written and pretty out of place.
I'm Burs Grokash, and I'm in charge of the St. Jib's Fair. All I need is clowns, monkeys, and jugglers. No, wait. Just need jugglers.
But yeah, that Giab apparently just killed an entire species, became a living saint, and now got killed by Daedra. What a tale. And then there's the final rumor that mentions the destruction of Aldrun, which was the biggest Redoran town in Morrowind. Seems pretty cut and dry, but I'll come back to all of this in a moment. Okay, so, these rumors cover Skyrim and Morrowind. But what about the other provinces? Well, the closest we get to a response to that question is in this really vague ending line.
It seems it is a dire situation throughout all of Tamriel.
And now, let's look at all of this as a whole. What was this whole current events dialogue thing? Well, I personally found it a very interesting way to deliver some behind-the-scenes world building, even though it seems like not much of it amounted to anything. I do think there could have been lots more dialogue, but you know how that story goes, right? Disk space, etc. But would I really be able to go sleep at night if I didn't have the chance to talk about some cut content as well? This won't surprise anyone, but it seems that originally all of this lore-type dialogue was indeed meant to cover much more. How do I know this? Well, for example, when the lines you just heard mention a specific province, a variable is also set. Set variable sharing the name of the province. You can see these variables being kept in a script called generic current events script. And, lo and behold, said script also contains variables for High Rock, Hammerfell, Valenwood and Orsinium, despite there being no lines that would actually use said variables. I highly doubt that these variables were just made for the heck of it, and it's too strange to have a portion of provinces covered, so I guess they just cut a portion of it, or just never recorded whatever else they had written down for use here. But that's not all. Remember when I said it would be cool to have background lore in addition to the current events? Well, it seems that was meant to be the case at first, as there's a whole other quest in the same naming scheme for that exact purpose. Said quest is fittingly called generic lore. Sadly though, it is completely empty, and it does not have any remaining dialogue or leftovers of any other kind. It does have a matching script, but said script is just as empty as the quest. So there's nothing I can say about this whole thing besides the fact that it's clear that Bethesda had greater ambitions for the whole background lore system than what eventually ended up in the game. And if that already made you sad, it's only gonna go downhill from here, as now we're switching over to Skyrim and we'll be taking a look at which portions of this interesting lore actually made it over, and which didn't. Based on the title of the video, I suppose you already have a good idea of which direction we're headed in. Let's start with Elsewhere. There's basically no mention of the skooma problem, or tribal chiefs and tribes for that matter. But even more interesting is the fact that they completely forgot to even mention the Rinder Jakrin. I'll give Bethesda this. I get why they wouldn't want to mention them again, seeing as they were already a throwaway faction in Oblivion, but hey. So, what became of the Elsewhere rumors? Nothing. And that also goes for the Somerset Isles rumors, but once again, I can kinda understand that seeing how minor they were. Although it could have been an interesting setup for the Altmer Imperial struggles. Then with Black Marsh, we're really starting to go down south. Fort Swampmoth never gets mentioned again, at all. And basically the exodus of all non-Argonians from the lands never gets brought up again either. The whole thing kinda gets glanced over by the tie-in novel by Greg Keyes, but that's a whole other story for another day. Something that I also find of note is that the lore articles online often describe the histories recalling the Argonians to defend the land from the Daedric invaders. There's never any concrete source for this claim, as it's just based on the inconclusive rumor you heard before. Fan speculation at its finest. So if you can just scratch off Elsewhere, Black Marsh and the Somerset Isles from the list, does that mean the interesting parts from Skyrim and Morrowind lore stay intact? No, most certainly not. Weird how for the game that actually takes place in the region mentioned most often, they decided to just completely ignore basically all lore that's been set up. Firstly, there's never any evidence that any particular Nords from Skyrim fought with any notable members of House Redoran. There also doesn't seem to have been any Orcish mercenaries involved. Neither the Nords, Orcs or Dunmer will ever mention any particular wars or battles have been fought. Then there's the whole Solstheim debacle, which is even more ridiculous. The Nords wanted to try and capture the island due to a border dispute and wanted to remove the Imperial fort. Right? Well, that's one of the most obvious signs that no one double-checked that. Either that, or they just didn't want to include it anymore. Solstheim, which appeared in the Dragonborn DLC for Skyrim, was clearly never captured, and its fort was never the place of any big border dispute battles. In fact, the DLC makes it quite clear that the fort got specifically destroyed by the eruption of Red Mountain. The whole ownership of the colony and island in itself is a big mess, but I'm not gonna go delve into that here. Speaking of messes though, that whole houses debacle mentioned previously. We went from highly respected Tresnalu, basically destroyed Ridoran and Indoril, and Wildcard Telvanni, to fully destroyed Lalu, which lost its greater house status, to unknown Tres and a very respected House Redoran, with a reformed House Indoril. The only one that seems to have been kept consistent between the two is the wildcard status of House Telvanni, which makes sense I guess. But the retcons of these rumors are, well, I wouldn't say passable, but they still pale in comparison with the Oblivion Crisis rumors. Despite only covering 2 provinces, they still bungle it up pretty damn bad. You know how Skyrim was hit bad by the Daedra forces? How the old holds were basically decimated and the Greybeards spoke of the end times? Well, nothing of that is ever shown to you in Skyrim. The closest thing we ever get to a meaningful connection to Oblivion's events in Skyrim is the museum in Dawnstar. Okay, it's quite cool, but it really stands out that basically no one mentions what was supposed to be a very bad crisis in the land. Granted, almost no one you meet in Skyrim was alive or present during these events, but that doesn't make it right. It only happened about 300 years ago. We in the real world still think about tragedies far older than that. Even in the Middle Ages, some scholars knew what happened in ancient times, so why does no one ever mention what happened? No spoken sources, no written books, no monuments or visual implications in any of the cities? I feel like an oversight of this magnitude doesn't happen by accident. I think someone at Bethesda effectively made the choice to not include too much connection between the 2 games as to not alienate their player base. Remember, a fun game is more important for Bethesda than a deep, lore-rich story. And I get it. It would be kinda weird to not have any context for all of these ruins and events when playing a game, but there are so many alternatives that could have been used rather than just ignoring an entire realm-spanning crisis. Alas, that's what they chose to do, so be it. Though, while I can kinda understand those retcons, the Morrowind ones are just plain stupid. The most inoffensive one is about the Telvanni. It's the only time it's ever brought up what they were doing during the crisis. Branchay's story in the base game basically confirms that the house got pretty decimated if it only has a single living heir. Of course, Skyrim doesn't really do anything with that whole setup, and the fact that there are still associated families like the Marians wandering around tell us that they are at least still pulling through in one way or another. And then Nelot happened, and he didn't really elaborate on either of the 2 known things. He doesn't ever state the role of House Telvanni during the crisis, nor does he ever really speak about who runs the show now. Oh, and neither do any of the other retainers associated with the house in that DLC, for that matter. So, okay, the Telvanni tried stopping the invaders, and that's basically that. How about Vivek? Well, just like the majority of Vardenfell, he was basically just retconned away. That vague rumor you heard about him being taken by the Daedra, well, that's the last thing ever spoken about him since 2006. Even in Skyrim and the Dragonborn DLC, Vivek, the character, barely gets mentioned. The only new information is that he is now part of the False Tribunal and is no longer worshipped by the Dunmer people. The rest is just open-ended, I suppose. Then there's the rumor about Aldrune, which is basically the first one from the entire batch that actually got followed up on. Yeah, baby, I'm sorry, but I love when they actually give a shit. I know it's a recurring theme that I'm negative about stuff like this, but Bethesda's a hard baby to love. But sometimes there's that glimmer of hope that just keeps you going. In this case, yes, the town of Aldrune was completely destroyed by the Daedra horde, which has some more interesting lore behind it and is one of the reasons why you encounter House Redoran on Solstheim, as well as numerous other changes with the Dunmer regime, such as the removal of Lalu from the Great Houses. But that's about enough positivity. What was that about Saint Giap again? He got killed in Morrowind? Well, not according to the Dawnguard DLC he didn't. No, his soul appears in that DLC and he himself claims to have been soul-trapped during the invasion of Kvatch. Okay, stop. I get why you wrote it that way, Bethesda. This way you could reference both Morrowind and Oblivion with one character. But why Giap? Wasn't it already weird enough making him a saint? Do you think no one would have given a toss if the Daedric horde killed a living saint in Kvatch? Both Cyrodiil and Morrowind would be completely shocked. Again, I get why you wrote it this way, but sometimes you gotta think about the implications. Also, Giap is one of the named souls found in the Soul Cairn, but there are also numerous generic unnamed ones. These guys can already reference the Oblivion Gates, so having Giap dying in Kvatch while working on a book seems so much more unnecessarily lame than him dying in his homeland, possibly fighting off the Daedric invaders. I also love the idea that people try going back to Oblivion in order to find Giap in Kvatch, like that makes any sense at all. And as an added bonus of stupidity, there's also this line from Mjolnir the Lioness, which basically invalidates Giap's whole sainthood. Unless the idea here was to suggest that the Cliff Racers just repopulated, which it surely wasn't. Just copy and paste my earlier comment about thinking about the implications of a reference before making it, and then we're done here. Yes, I would ask your thoughts on this, but I kinda don't need to. I know not everyone will be as against these retcons as I am, but can you really support this method of writing game by game and not thinking of the consequences? Bethesda's new Fallout trilogy suffers from the same problems, and I'm pretty sure the fanbase is even more annoyed there. But yeah, let me know your thoughts regardless, and I'll see you in the future. Probably.